From up here, you cannot see anything. There are people who say, it's down below there somewhere, believe it or not. At night, if you put your ear to the ground, you can sometimes hear a door slamming. A harsh, windswept land, rocks and cliffs forming a terrain that slides brusquely down into the sea. It is here, in this, the furthest inlet of the Adriatic Sea, the ancient Caput Adria, that the history of Trieste begins. Perhaps from a castelliere, one of the many fortified villages built on the high grounds of the Karst during the Bronze Age, 16th century BC, connected to an important area of transit and trade. One theory is that the name Tergeste, from the language of the ancient Veneti, testifies to an area where, thanks to a network of proto-historic trails and to the landing places along the coast, it was easier to trade. Perhaps, as the Greek geographer Strabo says, the name comes from Frurion, a fortified place to keep a border under control. Among the many hypotheses, there is a certainty given by sources and finds, that Trieste, in the 1st century BC, was a Roman colony. Rome, for some time, had been present in the Po Valley and in the lands of the Veneti, with whom it had forged a strong alliance. Later, it began to extend its sphere of influence over new territories, to the north, beyond the Alps, and to the east. What remains nowadays of the Roman layout in the fabric of the modern city, imposing ruins or fragments wrested from the ground, make it possible for us to reconstruct partly the shape that in time, conditioned by the difficult natural environment, was given to the city. There are sacred sites and sites for politics at the top of the hill of San Giusto, with the temples and the Civil Basilica in which to administer justice and make deals. Here we have urban architecture rich in symbols and the expression of specific power hierarchies. Looking out onto the sea, the Forum, the space of a community that celebrated here the memory of its past through complex decorations and monuments to renowned figures, placed there to inspire virtue. Examples from the past to guide the future of the community. The steep hill was worked into terraces, descending to the level of the coastline, and the usual rational standard that the Romans employed to divide space according to straight axes allowed maximum use of the buildings. Around a network of streets, many of them shallow flights of steps, houses and other places of worship rose up. And then squares and shops, workshops, taberna, and aqueducts, one of which, almost 17 kilometers long, supplied the city with water, bringing it from Val Rosandra. Near the sea, there was a theatre, and along the ancient coastline, different from today and further back, a complex system of harbours. with wharfs, piers and warehouses in which to deposit the goods unloaded from the ships. The necropolis were lined up along the edge of the two main roads going out of the city, one towards Aquileia, the other one towards Istria. Towards the west, first-class residential buildings dotted the coast, while in the direction of the Gulf of Muggia, with a continuity that the centuries have only partially modified, beside the houses, there were many productive workshops supplying a lively market. What remains nowadays of that city, which between the 1st and 2nd century AD reached the height of its splendour? Besides the finds preserved in the museums and remains of monuments, based on what has been unearthed with the new archaeological research, much must still be hidden in the entangled fabric of the houses, in the narrow roads that ascend and descend the hill of San Giusto, under the buildings that hide what the excavations between the 19th and 20th centuries brought to light and then buried forever. An invisible city. Fragments to reassemble. The most ancient proof of Roman Trieste is given by these inscriptions displayed in the Lapidario Tergestino and dated 33 to 32 BC, when after a series of military campaigns against the unruly population of the Japides at the eastern borders of our territory, and once peace was re-established, Octavian, not yet Emperor Augustus, gave orders to build walls and towers in defense of the city.
Cum ergo is rationibus erit salubritatis menium collocandum.
The place chosen for the foundation of the wall must be in a fertile territory, so that it can guarantee abundant harvests for the livelihood of the population. What exactly was the cause of the walls of Roman Trieste is still an unresolved matter. The remains that emerge do not resolve the doubts of the archaeologists. Perhaps they followed that which today is Via Rota, a flight of steps going down the hill of San Giusto. Could the line the houses follow perhaps hide the ancient alignment of the walls? Or, maybe, these remains that Via del Seminario preserves are what is left of a 1st century BC boundary wall, that once it had fallen into disuse was reutilized as terracing? It was here that, behind the theatre, the road from Aquileia entered the city, a road that today traces in its last part Via Donota. And of the wall which existed between the end of the 4th and the beginning of the 5th century AD remains a fragment of a tower, built also using material taken from disused Roman buildings to protect the city from barbarian incursions that were becoming more and more frequent. Remains of the ancient urban fabric emerged in the 1999 excavations that brought to light this monumental structure with 4 limestone pillars decorated with floral motifs with fluted columns near the edges. This might have been an arch built astride the route of the ancient road, datable to the first half of the 1st century AD, which occupied a key position on an artificial terrace near what must have been another forum for trade, opening onto the port, with a setting typical of Roman Greek towns of Asia Minor, an area with which the Roman Trieste had very close relationships. And it is once again the old city that preserves perhaps one of the gates of Roman Trieste, Largo di Riccardo. It owes its name to a legend that would place Richard the Lionheart's prison here when he passed this way, returning from one of his crusades. A legend that is probably generated by a mispronunciation of the word Ricario, a medieval magistrate whose seat was nearby. Ancient stories apart, there remains, almost enveloped by houses that partially hide it, this arch made of Auresina stone, dating back to the middle of the 1st century AD. Further excavations have brought to light some remains of the 4th century walls, when Largo di Riccardo, with a defensive tower before it, became effectively a gate through which a road, coming from the port, ran, and which led towards the top of the hill. A new monumental entrance to the city's decumanus? Or what do we say of the equally imposing one that led to the enclosure of a sacred place, revealed by nearby archaeological excavations, and interpreted as a temple of the Magna Mater, or of Civile? More fragments of the invisible city. Easy to defend, and with a control that from the high plateau ranged over the entire gulf. A sunny slope that was, above all, protected from the strong northeastern winds. The Roman architects chose for Trieste a space that offered many opportunities. A rich decoration of spirals and arms in relief. Nearby, an ancient column inserted in the medieval walls of San Giusto. Others at the base of the bell tower. Going up inside the tower, a relief with 2 griffins. In the middle, in the act of pouring a drink, a winged youth. Orto lapidario. An underground passage, and the remains, even more hidden, of a flight of stairs. A triangular fragment with an eagle, a peacock, and the mythological Medusa, symbols sacred to Jupiter, Juno, and Minerva. The enormous base of an equestrian monument dedicated to Valerio Festo Quirinale, proconsul of the province of Asia. Fragments for reconstructing what the Cathedral of Trieste hides today. What would actually have been seen by someone who, like us today, climbed the steep road that led up here from the port and the lower part of the city on a route that traces today's Via della Cattedrale? A monumental entrance, a propylaeum, with a central staircase, and on both sides 2 projecting parts with Corinthian columns. And above them, a richly decorated frieze of weapons and plinths and ornaments of a sacred character on the inner side. A construction of Aurusina limestone, material kept for buildings of status and rank that both celebrated and enclosed a sacred area. Perhaps dedicated to Jupiter, Juno, and Minerva, which the 3 symbols of the cusp identify, and which the old name of Caporo, from Capitolium, given to the area, testifies to. Perhaps here there was once a temple that celebrated the imperial cult. Perhaps. The excavations carried out have not in fact managed to explain clearly the shape and above all the function of this building, and some scholars argue that the area of the Capitoline temple was the area on which later the castle's foundations were laid. But here too the medieval constructions have cancelled definitively any possible evidence of ancient buildings. The sacred character of the place has remained in time, with the overlay first of a Christian basilica in the 5th century, on which, between the years 1000 and 1100, 2 parallel churches were built. These were later united and became the 14th century basis for the present-day cathedral. That which time has not been able to cancel is the space chosen by the Roman architects to build the Civil Basilica, where, by recovering ancient fragments, the columns have been reconstructed in part, and of the Forum, a square, 70 metres by 30, not very big, obtained by levelling in part the rock of the hill, and in part by creating some elements of supporting substructure. The Civil Basilica was extraordinarily big, 88 metres long and almost 24 metres wide. Owing to the difficult climate, it probably hosted inside many of the activities connected to the Forum that were normally held outdoors. Divided into 3 naves, the central hall was 2 floors high. They were completely surrounded by a double colonnade with a balustrade. Here public meetings were held, justice was administered, and economic transactions took place. The Curia was certain to be found here, where life in the city was run. The heads of Jupiter and of Medusa come from this area and are preserved in the castle's museum. They are very similar to those found in Aquileia, Pula and Zada, arranged perhaps among the columns of the first and second level of the balustrade, where heads of divinities alternated with reeds held up by cherubs. A walk in the tangle of small roads which wind up and down the hill of San Giusto and to the sea. A glance in the courts, the shadows of a passageway, or of a small square, through the broken down walls of houses. Understanding how collapsed walls, rubble and neglect first modified and later hid what once was the very life of Roman Trieste and of its inhabitants.
Igi turis qui communi sunt fortuna, non necessaria magnifica
Common
vestibula,
people, logically,
né tavolina, né
do not need
creatia,
entrance
quod
halls
aliis
or splendid
et
foyers,
estat ambiundo,
since it is
neque
they
ab
that
alis
pay
ambiundo.
homage to others.
Item.
From the sacred places and the places of power, to the homes, the domus, like the one in Piazza Barbacan, built in the 1st century AD near to Arco di Riccardo, right in the heart of the old city, and that very recent excavations have begun to investigate. A single high-class home, so extensive that the archaeologists have hypothesized that the ruins found lower down in Piazza Trauner and even further below in the Crosada excavation are part of the same building complex. The material that was mostly used to build the walls were blocks of sandstone joined with mortar. Bricks were rarely used. Various types of tiles were used for the roofs. Around the courtyards, like the model widely in use in central Italy, the various rooms developed. A house closed in on itself. The slope of the hill was put to good use, and singular solutions were found, resulting in the rooms having different levels. Among the rubble, used in ancient times to fill in the rooms that were no longer used, these fragments of frescoes emerged, the typical decoration of a luxury house. The choice of the motifs, leaves, flowers, birds, representations of a garden in bloom, or this mythological griffin, or the elegant dance of a Maenad in the procession of Bacchus. The use of colours like cinnabar, rare and costly, testify to the will of the proprietor to make the house look particularly grand, a house which has yielded expensive ornaments, this bronze lantern, together with more simple ceramics. In the city and in the houses, the water supply was provided by wells or by running water that came through the aqueducts. The only one of which there are considerable remnants is that of Val Rosandra, with a route that started at the foot of Monte Carso, with the Fons Oppia, where the waters of the Rosandra stream, and then of the Crogole and the Dolina sources, were channeled and made to flow in conduits almost a metre high, made of square stones and bricks and with a watertight coating in mortar and fragments of bricks. Its dimensions permitted an estimated daily flow of 5,800 cubic meters of water. On the upper part, at varying distances, there were small openings like these, which can be seen at the archaeological site in Borgo San Sergio, and which made it possible to clean and check the canal. Here, in part, it was dug out of the rock, and in part made of blocks of sandstone bonded with mortar. The slope was slight. The aqueduct reached Via dell'Istria, San Giacomo, Via San Michele. One branch entered the city from the side of the hill of San Giusto, while the other one passed through Via della Galleria, Via della Valle, as far as Via del Bastione and the Cavea fountain, the heart of the old city of Trieste.
Sed procul, inclusas audit ridere puellas, lupus.
At a distance, however, I could hear girls laughing, secluded, where a sacred wood took the shape of a round, shaded clearing, the secret site of the goddess, the sacred sources of women, and the rites never revealed to men without punishment. A stone slab and an inscription, Lucio Apizio, Tito Arunzio, had the shrine built at public expense. Barbie Stadium, Lucio's Liberta, freed female slave, gave to the Bona Dea. 2 stone basins, datable to the end of the 1st century BC, dedicated to the cult of the Bona Dea, a goddess whose true name must not be pronounced. Fragments of a sacred place, today invisible, which the centre of the modern city hides under roads full of traffic, under the foundations of buildings between Via Santa Caterina and Via San Lazzaro. Plans and period photographs of the early 1900s, when the remains of a temple came to light. A very simple temple, dedicated to a divinity that was anything but simple, beneficial and therapeutic, bestower of powerful remedies, invoked to grant the gift of procreation to women and of fertility to the land. The mystery cult was probably for women only, the domine, aristocratic women belonging to families of rank, and for the slaves or freed slaves, the liberte, who were their ministre or magistre, their priestesses. In San Sabba, a neighbourhood of Trieste, the city gives way to the suburbs and coexists with last century's industrial architecture. Right here, at the end of the 19th century, near a now almost invisible coast, ancient remains were found, which were interpreted for decades as those of a fulonica, a sort of large, ancient textile factory. Recent hypotheses instead talk of an olive press, built near the sea and linked to a house and a landing place. Only fragments remain of this insight into a far-off life, such as this refined head of a woman. Trieste must have had many olive presses that were in continuous use from the 1st to the 6th or 7th century AD. It is once more the recent excavations in the old city that have brought to light what remains of one of these structures. Very late, dated between the end of the 5th century and the beginning of the 6th century AD, also in the area of Via dei Capitelli, an important road which connected the coast and port with the hill of San Giusto. All the elements that made up the lever-based oil press remain. The limestone block in which were inserted the poles that had to support the prelum, the central beam, the weight that lowered it, the oil collection tank, the block with a groove that allowed for pouring. The remains of the quays, today distant from the coastline, that in Roman times was not far from the base of the hill of San Giusto. Another fragment of the invisible city. The port facilities, says Vitruvio, must be planned in order to offer ships a safe harbour in case of storms. Rules that were also followed in Trieste, which had a system of docks and piers with stores behind for stocking goods. Once again, Vitruvio suggests that porticos, or arsenals, should be built all around, with access to the warehouses. And towers should be erected on both sides of the entrance pier, from which to stretch chains with winches. What of the Lanterna, the first lighthouse of Austrian Trieste, which entered service in 1833? Who knows if it hides one of these towers?
Cum forum constitutum fuerit.
Once the forum had been built, the next step was to choose a place, the healthiest possible, in which to build the theatre. What remains of Venus's statue? A fragment of Bacchus. And then Aesculapius, patron of the medical art, connected to healing water with Aegea, his companion, and the goddess of health. And again Apollo, and a Silenus lying down. A slightly larger statue of Minerva, the goddess patron of the arts. Nearby, almost looking at them, the bust of a high official, maybe Quintus Petronius Modestus, born in Trieste, Emperor Traiano's procurator, remembered in 3 epigraphs as the person who restored the theatre. A theatre that, hidden by the stratifications left by time, and by the houses that had been built on top over the centuries, came to light in the 1930s, in an area that hid in its name, Arena Vecchia, Old Arena, its ancient existence. As with other buildings, here too the natural slope of the land was exploited and modified. And in this way, we must imagine it. In its heyday, after the interventions of Quintus Petronius Modestus, at the beginning of the 2nd century AD. The Cavea, the space, divided into steps and intended for the spectators, followed, in part, the line of the hill of San Giusto. Around its perimeter, a ring-shaped corridor with 2 passages, the vomitoriums, that made it possible to reach the higher tiers of seats. All around, a mighty perimeter wall, approximately 15 meters high. Near the stage, the proscenium, there was what was called the orchestra, the area for the personalities of rank, who from close up could follow the actors and enjoy a scene richly decorated with painted plasters, various coloured marble, and statues of gods. Colours, architectural styles and statues, the rigid order of the seats, everything becomes a reflected image of the society of the time, a kind of microcosm where everyone, statues of gods, emperors, men of power, or simple citizens, had and was in his place. On the outside, along the Porticus post scenum, the view of the sea, from which the theatre was separated only by the coastal road. On the western side of the hill of San Giusto, Via Donota traces the route of the ancient road that connected Trieste to Aquileia. A part of the area, between 1980 and 1985, underwent works of urban renewal. This made it possible to investigate new and important remains for a better knowledge of the Roman and then medieval city that right here in the 12th century built its boundary walls punctuated by towers. And time has also preserved, layer after layer, the very fragments of what was, between the end of the 1st century BC and the beginning of the 1st century AD, a house built on several levels. Over time, the common areas were put to different use. On top of the house, by then abandoned and collapsed, a big funerary enclosure was built with a central tomb for a rich family of the 2nd century AD. In time, between the 4th and 5th centuries, inside and outside the enclosure still more graves were added, chest tombs, graves or burial amphoras. These amphoras especially were used to bury very young children. A burial ground which occupied a part of the city that had evidently been abandoned, and which up to the 6th century continued to be filled with new tombs, this time in a disordered manner. Many of these were of children. The tomb discovered in Via Crosada was of a girl, 3 or 4 years old, in a burial ground dated around the 3rd century AD. The child had been laid out on a bed of shells. A lamp would have illuminated her road towards the world of shadows. A dice would have recalled her games, and at the same time fortuity that regulated life and death. An egg, ancient symbol of rebirth, was also part of the funerary equipment, a rare and exceptional find. A rather widespread practice in the Middle Ages, the reuse in different ways of that which in ruins or in fragments remained of ancient times. Marble, epigraphs, statues, columns were incorporated in the new buildings and often reworked and reinterpreted. And in the 1300s, this Barbi Stela, a funerary monument of one of the most important and famous Italic merchant families, was used in the doorway of the Cathedral of San Giusto. Not just simply used. The stone was cut in half and inverted, so as to have the more finished sides towards the inside. The Barbi family was also well documented in Aquileia and in Istria, where they had large important estates, and in transalpine trade. The last portrait, at the bottom on the right, which the epigraph says to be of the Liberta Tullia, was transformed into the portrait of San Sergio, with the addition of a halo and a halberd. The model of an ancient residence near the coasts. Mosaics from the 1st century AD. Black and white tiles to make refined geometric floor patterns. Artifacts of a very high technical quality, made by skilled workers who were probably not local. And then fragments of bricks with the hallmark of the maker, or of a great aristocratic Roman family, the Crispinis, of which Cavea Crispinilla was a member, a figure among the power elite in Rome, controversial and criticised, remembered by Tacitus as a teacher of pleasure for Nero, perhaps an entrepreneur in a male world, whose enormous wealth was due to possessions throughout the empire. And also the broken statue of a young man reproduced in marble. The Diadumenos, the athlete who ties around his head the victory band. Still fragments of the invisible city. Of a villa built outside the city and whose remnants came to light at the end of the 19th century when the small village of Barcola on the northwest coast of Trieste was transformed into a residential area. Surveys and plans were made, finds and mosaics were retrieved, and then what had come up from the earth was covered and hidden forever. A magnificent building complex, which from the sea rose up the slope of the hill with consecutive terraces in a spectacular panoramic effect, with rooms flaunting luxury and power. Perhaps the villa belonged to Valerio Quirinale, the prefect of the fleet of Ravenna, who Nero forced to commit suicide in 56 AD. Later, perhaps, the same emperor, following established practice, offered it to Cavea Crispinilla. Perhaps. The garden must have been superb. Pliny the Younger describes one in a letter. The path is bordered with box, and rosemary where box does not grow. Indeed, where it is protected by the roof, it flourishes, while under the open sky and facing the full force of the wind, the sea spray, though coming from far away, dries it out. Along the inner edge of the walk, a vine, still young and shady, soft earth, tender and yielding to the ground, even under bare feet. The garden is covered with an abundance of mulberries and fig trees. This view is not inferior to that of the sea. From up here, you cannot see anything. There are people who say, it's down there somewhere, believe it or not. At night, if you put your ear to the ground, you can sometimes hear a door slamming.